39 on internet standards and best practices and the implications of non-implementation of them on cybersecurity. Last year, NL IGF, who was also organizing this event, organized a workshop number 90, which was on critical infrastructure and incidents involving that and cross-border cooperation. And one of the topics that was brought up there was standards and the implementation of standards and non-implementation of standards. And in fact, it was a colleague of Jari who brought that up. And that stuck to our minds as a potential topic for this year. And when the Ministry of Economic Affairs in the Netherlands published their vision at the end of 2013, they also stated that the implementation of standards and internet best practices is critical for cybersecurity, but also that they noticed that very often they were not implemented by industry, and they wondered why. But also they noticed that a first mover advantage was not always there. It's not in your interest to move first. In fact, it may actually, for industry partners, be a negative thing to move first. And that was enough to, within NL IGF, decide we're going to move this forward as a topic for 2014 here in beautiful Istanbul. And here we are. What we are going to do is go over a couple of topics looking at what internet standards and best practices are. We're also going to look at several parties that actually work in drafting these practices. But we're also going to look at parties who actually may have to work or do work with them or do not work them, find out reasons behind that, and look at the future. Are the stakeholders and the right stakeholders on this table to discuss this in the future? And I think that the answer may be yes, but we will look into that and look finally into recommendations, how this topic could actually be changed, and perhaps come up with a topic for 2015. I'm going to start with introducing the panel, which I will do for the sake of time. I'm going to start with Aparna Sridinar, who is with Google as counsel. I've got Michael Reardon from the Messaging Anti-Abuse Working Group and Comcast. Thomas de Haan, who is senior consultant with the Ministry of Economic Affairs in the Netherlands. I've got Adam Sedgwick, who is IT policy professional at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States. I've got Adli Wahid, who is working for APNIC in Brisbane in Australia, but also active in FIRST, which is the global community of incident response teams. I've got Jari Arko, who's working with Ericsson, but is also chair of the IETF, the Internet. Help me there. I've got it here. But where are you? This is all in the wrong order, of course. Yes, thank you very much. I've got Chiara, and also have to look at Giovannini, who is Senior Manager Policy and Innovation at ANEC, which is the European Association for the Coordination of Consumer Representation and Standardization. And I've got Chip Sharp, who is Principal Engineer in Technology Policy and Internet Governance at Cisco Systems. And we have another person on the list who apparently was unable to make it from Africa, from which we haven't heard from. So maybe he's as a remote participant. If Sidi Bensouda is there, we will hear from him. What I've asked, and I'll introduce myself finally, let's do that also. My name is Wouter Natus, I'm a consultant. You can find me with many hats here at this IGF this year, but now I'm the moderator on behalf of NL IGF. I've asked Jari to come up with a short introduction of what internet standards and best practices are, and to set the scene on this topic. So Jari, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. And as I was talking to a colleague just before this session began, he had said that this could be summarized as people are not implementing standards. And well, I thought I should probably go into a little bit more depth. And actually, I think people are implementing standards, maybe not in all cases though, and there's more to it. So the thing that I actually want to emphasize is that there's a need for a broad approach for dealing with something like cyber security issues. So we need technical standards, we need industry and vendor best practices, we need corporate and individual best practices, even the users matter, that is, and we need legal and law enforcement frameworks. As an example, employing a secure service needs both the technology, the sound application of that technology in a network, careful users that employ the tools in a safe manner, and ways to deal with problems if they arise. It's usually not productive to place the burden just on these, on one of these aspects. We cannot fix all problems with technology, nor can we fix them with just more internet governance, for instance. But I wanted to talk about the best practices a little bit, and want to talk in particular about how standards organizations such as the IGF deal with this. Of course, we write technical standards. In the IGF, these are called, or they eventually come out as standards track RFCs. We also sometimes provide guidance on the best ways to use these technologies, or how to deploy them. And in the IGF, we call them best current practice documents, or RFCs. And just to give you one example of something that we've been working on quite recently, because of some of the surveillance revelations, we started working more on end-to-end security and ensuring that as much as possible from the various parts of internet traffic would be secured. And so we're working on improving the use of TLS in various applications, for instance. And we have a new working group called the UTA, or Using TLS for Applications, that is trying to figure out how to use TLS, recommend, these things should be turned on because they prevent these and these new attacks from being launched against you. So that's one example of the kinds of things that we are doing. But these types of recommendations are not just limited to IETF or the standards organizations. Also organizations such as RIPE, for instance, or ISOC are dealing with, or they discuss quite a lot about best practices, and also document them sometimes in documents. ISOC is running a new program for what they call Best Current Operator Practices, or PCOPs. I think we should be making more use of this type of recommendations. Sort of the engineer approach initially, at least in the IGF, has been that, okay, we provide the technology, but then it's up to you how to use it. I think it's actually beneficial in most cases to provide far more information, exactly when is it useful and what kind of settings would be suitable for the configuration. So we could provide far more guidance than we currently are. But it's also not always easy. There are plenty of examples of slow deployment of new technology, security technology included. And it's not always easy to convince people to take it on because of first mover issues and other things. And of course, like most of the internet standardization world, or all of it really, is operating on this voluntary adoption principle, that we are doing standards, but we're not forcing anyone to use them, which is actually the only practical and sensible way of operating. But the downside of that is that then people need to be motivated to take into account or take into use something new. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that most major new things have some complexities. They may come with trade-offs that, okay, you can turn on security, but that will affect something. One good example of that, we've been talking quite a lot in the ITF about the use of TLS in web browsing, or HTTPS. There's a lot of discussion about what's the role of proxies and caching, other similar things like that in that context. So it's usually not possible to say that you just turn on security, it's all good for you in all possible cases, and there will be no downsides. That's not the reality that we live in. So I think I'll stop here and let others to talk more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. One more comment from my side, which was meant for you, which I forgot. This is not a panel with long presentations and slides, as you noticed. We're going to have an interactive one. And what's even worse, you're supposed to interact with us. So if you are able to and want to ask any questions to the panelists, please feel free to do so. Just raise your arm and I'll walk over to you. We have several people in the panel involved in the creation of standards, the drafting of standards, and from many different angles, and just go from left to right. Mike, you do a lot of work in MOL. Could you describe in a few words what you do and what the implications are?
Yeah, I work, one of my roles is to work for a group called the Messaging, Malware and Mobile Anti-Abuse Working Group. It's rather long-winded. But basically, if you think about it, it's an operational security community for some of the largest ISPs, mail senders, hosters, social networks on the planet. And we come together to address the operational problems that we encounter in terms of abuse. And the one that comes most readily to mind is spam. I mean, spam is one of those things that pretty much everybody, though I am learning from the IGF that not everybody, there are some people who seem to be quite keen on not fighting spam, but most people actually believe that spam is a universally bad thing. And so we come together and we use the standards quite often that have been, or we encourage the use of the standards quite often that have been adopted at the IETF, or promulgated rather by the IETF. So, I mean, particular examples I'd use here are things like SPF and DKIM for email authentication, which is actually a great example because those were a great example of technical standards that came out, and on their own they had marginal use. But by the time they got to the operational community, people looked at them and went, if we were to write some best practices and well, there is an element of technology, but it's only minor, that sits on top of this, we can use the technical standards that have been generated at the ITF. And the example of this one is something called DMARC, which is a way of reporting on how email is disposed of. I mean, standards get adopted when they're useful. I mean, they also get adopted when they're adopted voluntarily. You don't want them rammed down your throat. And the other thing is they've got to have been reached by a consensus process. And I think that's where both MORG, where I work, and the IETF have proved to be very strong.
Adam Sedgwick from the US Standardization Agency, I think. Please explain your work.
Sure. So I'm with National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And we really have two roles that relate to this issue. One is an overarching responsibility that the U.S. has in partnering with international standards bodies. So the U.S. is actually unique in that with everything we do, we're supposed to rely on voluntary consensus standards first. And so we have a whole process called incorporated by reference, where instead of setting up something that's government unique, we work with the standards bodies if there is an existing standard, or we work with them to perhaps develop a new standard when the need is there. And that's not just for technology, that's for all sorts of things. So that's one of the roles. And then the other role is a responsibility we have under the Federal Information Security and Management Act, which is we actually develop standards and guidelines for federal departments and agencies. And so that's a responsibility that we have to ensure that the U.S. government and the roughly $80 billion that we spend a year for information technology can rely on commercial off-the-shelf technology. So in our laboratory program, we have people studying the technology and then figuring out where the guidelines are, which are pretty much equivalent to best practices, and then in some limited cases, we will develop standards, and all of that's done in collaboration with industry, with a very open, transparent process. And then one thing that we worked on just last year that was very consistent with this is, it is a good example of when we went to industry and said we have this need, what is out there, what can the market provide? And that was for the issue with critical infrastructure for cybersecurity. And it goes to a problem that policymakers saw that I think is at the heart of this session, which is that policymakers saw that there were a good set of standards and best practices out there, but we didn't see uptake sufficiently, or we wondered if there was sufficient uptake. So we had an open process to look what was out there, look what the best practices were, look what the standards were, and then to help develop a structure so they could be used voluntarily, and really help with some of the issues we saw, which included fragmentation due to different regulatory and legal regimes. So that's something we developed. We developed over the course of a year through open workshops. It's out there. We're assessing now the extent at which industry is using. And we really saw our role in that as a convener, bringing together these diverse stakeholders. And in the future, what we'd like to do with it is figure out a way so that our role as convener kind of moves on, so we're actually supporting industry even more and figure out what is a non-governmental way for these practices and standards to grow in the future.
As a question, when you develop a standard, is that an obligatory one to adopt by everybody, or is it still a voluntary process? Because I'm trying to find if there's a difference between your organization and the others.
So it's obligatory if you're a federal department and agency. So it's for those IT systems, and even those, they're all based on risk management. So it's basically the heart of those standards are how do you categorize information systems, and then how do you develop the risk management processes on top of that to best manage those risks.
Okay. Thank you. Atli Wahid, you're active in the RIR, the regional internet registries. You work on standards and best practices also, I suppose. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I just have a couple of points to add. So from the IRR perspective, what Hari mentioned just now on participating in developing technical standards, that's one of the things that we do. We have colleagues that participate in the meetings and look into the technical standards being discussed, whether or not it's IPv6 or DNSSEC or whatever. And I think this is very critical simply because our membership, when we have meeting and we have discussion with them, they will have a lot of questions on how the technology works, what are the limitations, how does it impact security and things like that. So from one end, that sort of participation is very critical. And of course, to participate in this kind of discussion, there is a prerequisite in terms of the technical knowledge that you must have to discuss in the development of the technical standards. But moving away from that, one of the other work that we do with our members is that we go and spend some time to work with the NOGs, the network operators groups, where they have meetings, and this is where a lot of training and discussions and exchange of information takes place. And one of the interesting stuff that takes place during this meeting is that normally people will be discussing issues like, I see a lot of DDoS these days, or I have issues on spam and things like that. So naturally, the next thing that people will ask is, what are some of the best practices that you apply to make sure that your customers are not affected, or you can be resilient, or you can mitigate this risk, right? So the discussion on best current practices is always something that we see and something that people always need, and there is a demand for this type of thing. So lately, one of the things that we've been trying to promote with people in the security community are things like BCP 38 or source address validation, and this will prevent attacks that exploit the ability to be able to spoof IP addresses in carrying out these attacks. And in some instances, it's just an awareness thing. But if you look at it from another angle, these are the things that people need so that they can look at it and have some reference. So it is not just enough to tell them that you must do something about this, but then they will ask, how do you do it then? Right? So to come up with a best current practice that is relevant and applicable and useful is something that the network operators groups are looking at. The other thing is that from the IRR perspective, we have this WHOIS database, and the WHOIS database is fairly useful at times when people want to find out who is the proper contact point when it comes to abuses. Again, the issue is that many of the network operators, many of our members will just put a contact point, but when we meet them and we have discussion with them, they will then ask, how do other people do incident response? What are the resources that they use? What are the procedures? So this shows that there is a need for these best current practices and for the discussions to be frequent, so that these things are up to date from time to time. I think I'll just stop at those 2 points. I have some other things, but maybe in a different round. Thank you.
Thank you, Atli. Taking away an important point, I think that you have to have some technical proficiency to be able to join the discussion. And that may then also inhibit from people joining these discussions. So that's a topic that we'll probably come back to later, but thank you for mentioning it. Jari, we had you. Of course, you've already explained what the IETF does. Thank you for that. But Chiara Giovannini, you are also involved in internet standards and best practices, but from a completely different point of view, from the consumer. So what is your role when they are created, and what's the role of the consumer in the discussion?
Yes, indeed. ANEC is a very special consumer association because our specialty is standards. You might wonder why. At the European level, standards are used to complement public policies and legislation. And this is why it is important to have all stakeholders around the table. So when a consensus is reached, it's a real consensus. We are covering many fields, and the Internet and the Information Society is one of the fields we are covering. At the European level, there is quite a lot of discussion on cybersecurity standardization. There is a strategy going to be developed together as well with the institutions, the European institutions. As I mentioned, there is really a complementarity about it, and consumers are going to follow this work. There is also very interesting work going on electronic signatures and certificates, which I think is very much relevant in this context of cybersecurity from the consumer point of view. Generally, we have experts participating. You just mentioned how important it is to have technical expertise. It is half of the problem, but the other problem or the issue is as I mentioned, the procedures which are leading to a real consensus. And this is really something which is very important, and it depends a lot on the standardization body we are mentioning. Our experience is more in the so-called formal standardization bodies, because there you have a procedure to reach a consensus where everyone can participate, or at least try to participate. There are other standardization bodies where the consensus is differently reached, and from a consumer point of view, it is almost impossible to have an impact in those standardization bodies.
Thank you. So that makes it hard to reach consensus from a consumer point of view, as I understand you correctly. We have heard the side of the people creating the standards or participating in the process of creating standards and internet best practices. Let's have a look at how this impacts industry. Because all these standards are made, but to implement them, it must have some sort of implication. And let's start on the other end and come back. Sorry, Aparna. But let's start with Chip. You work with Cisco. What exactly is, perhaps a very short introduction of Cisco for some people, and then go into the impact of standards for a company like yours?
Yes, Cisco Systems is a company that was founded around 1988. It builds much of the infrastructure that the internet runs on right now, the routers, switches, and it's also developed many collaboration systems, such as WebEx, which we're using here for the IGF, is also a Cisco product as well. So we're involved in many of the, not only the product, but also some of the applications and services that run over the internet. One thing is a little bit, just for my own purposes, I've been in the industry for over 30 years, and 20 of that at least is spent developing products and working on standards activities. In IETF, TIA, ETSI, ITT, a number of standards organizations. So just to give you an idea now, Cisco is involved in around probably over 75 standards organizations and fora that we have people engaged in. And picking just from 2002 to 2004, we had people involved in over 400 standardization efforts globally. I have something on the screen that goes with what I was going to say here, but one thing I was going to say is our industry is based on the industry-led and voluntary and international standards, developed by bodies such as IETF, World Wide Web Consortium, IEEE, and we want to seek to ensure interoperability and security globally. So the industry builds products based on these interoperable standards with a currently like a build once, sell globally business model as much as possible. That drives innovation, efficiency in product and services in the ability to do that. In terms of cybersecurity standards, these global standards are critical for interoperability and developing the global markets, but as well as improving cybersecurity posture, globally as well. And one thing we get into is like poorly designed or implemented or conflicting national standards can actually add risk to that posture and that global efficiency. So the way we look at it is that modern global standards tend to exhibit principles such as being voluntary, transparent, expert-driven, and provide for interoperability and scalability. Just to kind of give you an example, you look around your power strips now and see all the converters that are plugged in for all the different standards for power connectors. Each of these is a national standard. So whenever we go to a different country, we have to lug around, a different power converter to plug our stuff into, right? If you go to the next slide, oh, I can do that, right? Is that, which button do I push there? So if you remember these, did anybody here travel like globally in the 90s? When you access the internet via dial-up modems, and do you remember like carrying around a bag of a converter so you can plug into every country's telephone network? These are all national standards as well. So those were like every day you had to figure out if you actually could connect to the network somehow. And this is an example of a national-based standards. Oops, I think I just turned something off. What did I do? It just went, oh, there it goes. I got it. So, as we've moved forward, as the internet has grown and become more ubiquitous, what we've settled on are we now have more global standards. So with Ethernet, you have Cat5 Ethernet, you have a standard connector that you can carry one cable with you to plug in. And even better, nowadays, we don't even have to take connectors at all because IEEE has developed Wi-Fi. Everybody has 802.11 Wi-Fi. One standard, you go to IGF globally and you don't have to carry bags of connectors around with you. So these are examples, very simple examples of why global interoperable standards are so important, because you can build a product based on 802.11 Wi-Fi, and people can connect to it anywhere in the world that they go to. And there are some differences that we have to work with or because of spectrum, but in general, you can work globally with a single standard. And I think I had one more. Yari might recognize some of this. A number of years ago, Steve Deering had come up with what was called an hourglass model of the internet. And what's happened recently, as we added more and more applications, the hourglass kind of expanded into now it looks more like a martini glass, I think, is the way we look at it. To see why the internet scales and why globally and why it's so ubiquitous is that we have a stable middle right now with TCP over IP. Acts as a stable middle of the protocol. So no matter what network you're on top of, whether it's PPP, Ethernet, SONET, or optical, I should say, wireless, GSM, Wi-Fi, it doesn't matter what network you're running or subnet you're running over. You're always running IP over whatever the infrastructure is. And then on top of IP, there's a standard set of protocols, a standard API that you can write, the application providers can write to, or you can develop protocols on top of, so that all you have to do is run on top of TCP or UDP on IP, and then you don't have to worry about all that stuff at the bottom, all the different subnet protocols at the bottom. You don't have to worry about that. And then you have some number of protocols. Some of you might recognize some of them. HTTP is a web for web browsing. SMTP for mail, email. but the number of protocols that run on top of TCP/IP or UDP/IP. And now application providers or application writers don't have to worry about all that mess underneath. All they have to do is write to the API for any of those protocols, and then they can access anything in the world, right? So they don't have to worry about the details of the underpinnings in order to actually, expand and scale globally. And that's, part of the power of that has allowed the internet to grow globally and allow us to do what we do today here. So I'll stop there. There is one thing I would like to say, and I'm actually done, so we can turn this off. I figured out how to turn it off, I think. One thing that's interesting is, in being involved in standards for a number of years, is there's a senator from the United States that after retired, somebody asked him about passing legislation and what he thought about passing legislation. And I think what he said was applicable to a lot of the work that I've done. And he said basically that out of all the legislations he had done over the decades he had served, probably about 20% of it was useful and 80% of it could be thrown away. It was a complete waste of time. The problem was you didn't know which was the 20% until about 5 or 10 years later. That you didn't know which one was a waste of time and which one was useful until years after you've already spent the time doing it. And that's kind of a problem we have with developing standards, in terms of working within standards organizations. So thanks, I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. You've actually quite well explained that there are standards on the internet that actually make it work and are essential to make it work and to help it grow and economically grow. So I think that's very important to understand. Thank you. I'm going to move back to Mike, because you're an industry organization. What sort of, when you discuss your best practices, then they have to go back to your members. How do they implicate the members? What does it mean for them once this new practice comes out?
Given that we're certainly working at more, given that the best practices that we come out with have been arrived at voluntarily and in a sort of consensus manner, generally what happens is that they get applied. They get used. Because they're the sensible things that we all need to do. It's Morg's kind of, we're a standards body that operate, or not even we're not a standards body per se, but we generate best practices. But we do it in a spirit, because we're working in an area which is just an area of mutual nuisance, i.e. abuse on the internet. So we do operate in a very cooperative manner. I mean, as a slight aside, one day a reporter from the newspaper in DC, The Hill, rang me up and found out that I was working very closely with a guy from AT&T. And he asked me, did I fight with him a lot? And I said, no, I go out drinking occasionally. And just disappointed him terribly, and he never rang me back. But what we do is we work cooperatively because we're addressing what are mutual problems that impede all our businesses. And I think maybe that's where we see where we go forward, because we are dealing in an area which is a commonly problematic area. So it's in everybody's interest to work together. I mean, very interestingly, and it was a bit of a surprise to me, we also work with a bunch of the legitimate email senders. And there's been a very irritating process for most of us, I expect, which is where they imply they have permission to send you email because they've received permission to send you postal mail. And this was a practice known as e-pending. And our senders got together, the legitimate good senders, and they basically came out with a Morg standard saying we are going to suggest that e-pending is a really bad thing. And in the trade press not so long later than that, it was interpreted as Morg bans e-pending. And pretty much for all legitimate email senders, it's now stopped. So I mean, standards can, even cooperatively reached, can have some pretty drastic effects on business practice.
I'm going to switch to Thomas for 1 second before going to Aparna. An argument that at least I regularly hear is that when companies like yours come together and discuss all sort of secret things, more or less, or more open things on standards, that there are these people telling me things sometimes, say, well, what about the cartel and anti-trade people? Is this something where that doesn't play any role with Morg because you're there for 10 years.
You've already raised something that I do feel I need to interject. It does not play any role, and there is very strict guidance given for operating in these circumstances. And there are a number of bodies ranging from Morg through the Cable Labs, there's a bunch of bodies out there which have very strict constitutions and have been, approved to work in this manner.
Yeah. I have to say that it was Michael O'Riordan saying something, and not Thomas de Haan in the transcript. In the best practice group on SIRS, which I'm also signing on, that was one of the questions asked. What does happen when my government says something about the cartel problems around this topic? And that's why I'm very much afraid in my country to participate in that. The Ministry of Economic Affairs is presiding over telecoms and anti-spam law and the what do you call it, ACM is, what is the word in English? I'm searching for the ACM. What's it in English?
Yeah, competition authority.
Competition authority. Thank you very much. Couldn't think of it. You're presiding over all three, and in the Netherlands there's no problem to participate in Morg also. So do you have a general advice, perhaps, to other governments that have, where these issues may play, that this has nothing to do with competition, or?
I would say this is not a real point of debate which is affecting, let's say, the market or the standardization elaboration. I think we have seen this with power sockets. I mean, if it's for the efficiency and for the, let's say, the economy of scales and for, let's say, better and cheaper and products, then things can be done. So I don't think competition element is such a big thing here. I would say there are some other things which I find very pressing, but you are the moderator.
Okay, thank you for that, Thomas. I think that's an important message to perhaps other companies where these concerns do play. And it's also a matter of going forward, I think, because it was started by trial and error in the beginning, probably, and trust was built through the years to work together in a better way, I suppose, Mike, because that's the way it happened.
Speaking for what I do, I mean, it was a very deliberate process to come together. Back in 2004, when we started, when Mr. Gates had just told us that that spam was going to be sorted 2 years before, and apparently 2004 was the year that we came together to sort spam that it was meant to have been sorted by. And it's been these. I think this is a very strange. This is the first time I've heard this kind of argument sort of postulated, or this as being an important point. And I'm a bit surprised, to be honest with you, because there's an awful lot of these organisations that work in this manner and aren't seen as anti-competitive because they are seen as having the virtues that Thomas just elucidated.
I was surprised myself, but I'm deliberately bringing it up because it was brought up from other parts of the world where it apparently is seen as a problem to cooperate in this way. So, and perhaps it is in those countries, but then the government may need some more explanation, who knows, but at least it's on record at this moment. Aparna, Google is a very large company nowadays, affecting lots of ways of the internet, so you must be dealing with a lot of standards and best practices. How does that affect Google? Once more. Yes.
Sorry. Thanks for the question. I think, we as a company, well, let me state the obvious first. Standards are obviously critical to our business, especially internet standards, although not only internet standards developed by the Internet Engineering Task Force. And I think the way that we look at the standard setting process as a whole has a couple different components. The first is, the original set of internet standards is the reason that Google has been able to exist and flourish in the first place, right? The fact that we could connect computers with TCP/IP and that any person could deliver an application on top of this common protocol is what has allowed the internet to grow into this sort of global platform, and it's what's allowed innovators to come up with new products and ideas, and it's also what will enable the next person who has an idea like Google to be successful. So, for us, it's part business necessity and part philosophy. The second is that, obviously we're a global company, so interoperability is a big issue. So imagine if we had to have totally different standards to do search in every country across the world. That would make it much more difficult to deliver information to our end users. Obviously, there are local discrepancies in some circumstances, but in general, the fact that it is one internet and that one internet is enabled by internet standards is incredibly powerful. The third is I think that we view standards as critical to ensuring the resiliency and security of the internet. So without sort of redundancy in networks and a distributed architecture that the standard setting process enables, we really would not have the internet that we have today, and we wouldn't be able to deliver services to our end users in the way that we are today. And so then I think overall we say to ourselves the current model for standard setting has worked really well for the internet. And what are the sort of characteristics of the current model that are important? Well, number one, it's voluntary, right? So the reason to use a standard is that people think it's useful and it enables connection and sort of enables many people to access the same information or to use the same infrastructure. The second is they should be consensus-based. It doesn't make sense to adopt a standard if you can't convince your peers that the standard makes sense. And the third is the standard setting process should really be driven by the technical community. So I think you see great collaboration in places like IETF or at MOG, precisely because even if people are competing vigorously in the economic marketplace, they realize that interoperability and other standard setting processes are valuable for enriching the entire ecosystem. I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, but
It's a good start, so thank you very much. We've almost done our first round. Because we're going to look at the consumer and the government side in a short while. First, I'm going to ask, are there any remote participants, Sophie? No? Okay. If there's a question, let me know, please. Are there any questions so far from the audience? Anyone would like to ask a question? Two. I'm going to start in front and then come to you. Roelof Meijer, SEDN in the Netherlands.
Well, so I don't need to introduce myself. The title of the workshop is The Impact of Non-Adoption of Internet Standards. So I would be interested, for instance, to hear from Jari how happy he is with the adoption of proven standards that improve the security of the Internet on any level. For instance, DNSSEC or BCP 38. You can choose your own scale if you wanted to answer for your country, for Europe, for the world. But I would like to move the discussion a bit towards how are we doing on the implementation of standards that are really important for our future.
Thank you, Roelof. Jari.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously different answers based on what we are looking at. In some cases, I think we can be happy with. I think there's a lot of uptake on HTTPS, TLS, that kind of thing. There are other areas where, even with standards being available for a long time, we are not that far yet, or at least not completely done. And to take BCP 38 as one example, and for those that don't know what it is, this is the standard or the BCP that says you should do source address filtering to prevent spoofing. And the problem with that and it's very widely deployed. but it's not universally deployed. So there's, and I don't have the numbers with me right now, but it could be, I don't know, one third or 1/4 of the world not implementing that. But it would be really, really important to actually implement that, because it reduces the amount of DDoS attacks in the world, or at least make them a little bit harder to launch. But the trouble with why that is the case is that there's no immediate benefit to you. There's only benefit to the society or the planet as a whole, but it's not necessarily a benefit to you. In fact, in some cases, it could be more work. Like you have to turn it on. It's like it could be even one line command to turn it on in some cases, or more. So that's a really difficult situation. I think that's one example where maybe some processes within the IGF and cooperation across not just standards body people or techies getting together and saying, hey, this BCP 338 thing is great, but also going around and saying that, hey, you all should actually be talking to your local businesses to make sure that they are doing that. So I'm not entirely happy with all of these deployments, obviously, and we could have another discussion about DNSSEC, for instance, but there's clearly work to be done.
Thank you, Jari. I'm going to jump ahead a little of the questions that we have. What is the implication of let's stick with BCP 38 for this example, because there are many others. It comes out of the IETF at, I think, in 2000 something, and it's adopted or not, it's voluntary. We've assessed that. Let's go to Cisco or to Morg, whoever wants to answer. What does it actually cost? Well, the moment that something like that comes on your doorstep, we have a new standard or best practice implemented. What happens within a company at the moment that you start deciding on it? And could there be reasons, very logical reasons, for not doing it? So there's two questions. Chip?
This may not be a good example for us, because one of the co-authors of BC38 was a Cisco fellow who was actually in my group when he wrote it, when he did it. So it was based on our experience in developing networks. So, in that case, we had already built the capability into the router and delivered it to customers. So it was a matter of convincing customers to turn it on. And I think Jari hit the nail on the head on one case. Is what I look at is the benefits do not accrue to the organization that's incurring the expense, and that's a common issue with a lot of best practices and standards. Is the organization, say the network provider or whatever, that has to actually implement it does not actually see the benefits of it. He's doing it for the good of the internet. And many organization networks do implement these things because they understand that the more secure and stable the internet is, the more it will grow and more business will grow. But some don't. So that's just a common issue. I think spam has some of the spam thing has some of the same issues in terms of the benefits and expense trade-off. So that's one thing. Another thing I want to kind of point out in terms from a equipment point of view or from a network provider point of view is that it's one line, yes, but when you're managing a network of hundreds or thousands of devices, you generally do not go in and configure each device. So network providers build out scripts usually that manage the devices, configure it, and when you're even adding one line sometimes, can cause unexpected issues in the network, right? And we've had cases for I don't know if anybody remembers this, but there was a feature called IP-directed broadcast, which was in the IP standard. It was a general part of the standard, which allows you to send a packet to a local network, and then the router on that network will then broadcast it to every endpoint on that network. Seems like a good idea, but then came along Smurf attacks, where people would send one packet to a network, it would expand it to all the endpoints on that network who would then reply. So you could actually amplify an attack by using this. And it took Cisco, it took us, I don't know, 3 or 4 releases, several years to get the default of that feature turned from on to off. It seems like a very simple change, right? And even some of us working didn't understand why we couldn't do it. But what we found is that if you change the default on a configuration, you've now broken everybody's scripts, config scripts, that is, in their how they configure their networks. So you have to work very carefully to migrate, the customers over to this, educate them, let them know you're doing it, so they can, be in sync with the vendor, so that, one day they don't actually load a new version of software in your equipment and your network goes down. That's generally seen as unfriendly behavior. So thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Chip. I think you mentioned a couple of things. One, that it's costly, that it involves work within the company, obviously a lot of resources. It involves technical implications that you can't oversee, and it's not that easy because you have to get a whole community moving along with you and understanding why you're doing it. So there's I think 3 points summarizing that make implementation of a standard not something that you just do. Would you, any of Aparna or Mike, like to add to this example, or?
I'll just make a more general comment, which is I think sometimes the challenge is not, sometimes there is a true mismapping between who incurs the benefit and who bears the expense. But a lot of times it's more broadening the view of what the benefit is really the key. So for example, just take security standards for an example, right? Like you might say, oh, for security in email or best practices with respect to email, well, it's going to be a cost that Google incurs to make Gmail more secure, but the benefit inures to the user of Gmail. But that is not how we think of it, and I would say that's not how any email provider should think of it, right? The benefit for us is we're providing a more secure service, which hopefully means more people will use it, and we'll be gaining trust from the end user, which will make them continue to use our service, which is what we want, right? So I think sometimes there is a misalignment of incentives, but equally as often, it's just a matter of sort of figuring out what the benefit is for the person who has to adopt the standard.
Thank you.
I'd say what it's about is a sort of mutuality of benefit. That, Google may do something really smart that benefits us because we see less spam from them. We may in turn reciprocate to do something equally smart that means that we send them less spam. And if we're applying standards that work, when you see this mutuality of benefit. But I think you talk about the barriers. Effectively, we're talking about barriers to entry to some extent. One of the things I was involved in a couple of years back was I don't know whether you'd call it a standard, but it's certainly a best practice, was the what became eventually published by the FCC, called the ABCs for ISPs, the anti-botnet code for ISPs in the United States. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. Certainly there's the Australian I-code as well, which was set up in order to... And there what you found was that one of the biggest challenges was working through those barriers to entry. Because also when it comes to putting in some of these standards / best practices, for the larger organizations, for the larger ISPs, for the larger mail senders, what have you, it's a relatively small amount of cost, and it might in fact be something they're already doing because they've seen it as deriving to their benefit. But for the smaller players, sometimes bringing in play, there's just the pure economic barriers, the cost of implementing services, implementing data feeds, for example, customer education, customer notification in the case of botnets. These things can be relatively expensive, and that can be some of the reason that there is a resistance to enter into a sort of into this mode.
Well, I'm going to go on your question next. I'm going to jump again, I think, because we've identified something which is probably a crucial topic here, because it is a matter of economics whether you make the decision to implement or not, and the speed with which you do it, whether it's beneficial or not to a company. We have other parties on the table also. For example, a government. How could that be a role for a government to assist somehow in having the implementation go faster or better without legislation, just by aiding the process in one way or another? Thomas.
Thank you, Wout. Yeah, I think exactly what was mentioned here, that probably in the beginning of the internet and still now, new standards give benefits to all. So it's a kind of, let's say, externalities are have a big role here. But we are now in a situation which I think not adopting some standards will not benefit somebody else, but will even damage others. And I think that's the new era we are living in which, of course, the internet is an inherently insecure network. We are facing these kind of challenges. And then I would say, from the government's perspective, I would even consider that as a kind of market failure, meaning that you have a role as a government. When you see that certain parties or certain actors in the market are not doing something, and by that, as a consequence, others are having disadvantages, then there's something wrong with the way these standards are adopted. And that doesn't mean that you should turn around the whole system of voluntary standards, which made them in consensus, etc., with the participation of stakeholders. But for certain cases in which you should be also, I think as a government, you should really pick the ones which are essential in this game. These kind of standards in which if actors don't implement them, it will have an external effect on many others in society. So I don't think if that's what answer you were looking for.
It's the answer you wanted to give. And I was going to go to you, Adam, because you work from the government also. You told us about the processes that you got into last year. Could you tell us something about the motivation for your organization to step into internet standards and best practices? And what do you see listening to Thomas and to your other panelists?
So I think I would build off some of the earlier points that were made about the challenges of getting multiple parties to act when the cost might be diffuse. And I think it does go to a theme of this of the IGF, which is sort of the multi-stakeholder, and how do you get a lot of these solutions require a lot of players to come together and decide on collective action. And it often might not be because there isn't a standard or best practice, it might be because there's too many of them, or it might be for a variety of reasons difficult to choose. The market might not be there, or it does require all these different stakeholders to come together in a unified way, potentially in the case of malware all the way down to the end user, the person sitting on the computer. So we have taken this on in a variety of different ways to work really closely with industry to look at solution at these problems. I would say that the way that we approach core internet standards would be different than some of the other standards, just to ensure that we can protect the growth and the vitalization of the economy and the innovation that those standards provide. But I do think that there are a number of different mechanisms that government can use. So I spoke about the example of what we did with the cybersecurity framework for critical infrastructure. But in those other sectors, we've called them the Internet and Information Innovation sector. We've looked at projects such as the National Strategy of Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. And that's an effort that we still have ongoing, where we've pulled together people to form a nonprofit identity ecosystem, where they're the ones figuring out the rules of the road. And then the government then supports innovative uses of authentication through grants. So it's an ongoing project. It's open and transparent. Anyone can participate. And we think that in the long run, we think it already is having an impact on the market to the benefit of all consumers, and it will continue to in the long run. So there's actually quite a bit that the government can do in a way that's non-regulatory in a way that's open and transparent and really builds off what the market's already providing.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the gentleman who wants to ask a question. Please introduce yourself.
My name's Eric Jardine. I'm with the Center for International Governance Innovation. I'm a political science by background, so some of this material on the technical side is outside of my wheelhouse, we'll say. But I do have a question. Recognizing that this whole process is a very organic system and it reacts and it evolves, I'm wondering, from sort of a cost management point of view, for the system as a whole, do you think the universal adoption of security standards is necessarily the best outcome that we should be pushing for here? And my thinking behind this is basically, just in a very rough sense, the aggregate costs to the system of a failure in the best practices or a security protocol is sort of related to the probability that there's a vulnerability multiplied by the numbers of people who are using that standard. And so the probability of best practices might be low, but if you had everyone using the same standard, then the standard ends up having a vulnerability in it that someone uncovers, then everyone becomes vulnerable and the system might suffer a tremendous cost as a result. So there's, I think, a degree of resiliency and cost management that comes in when you actually have multiple standards at work. So I'm just wondering on anyone's take on that particular issue. Thank you.
I could. So that actually might go to kind of how we started the session with Yari's point about maybe he would disagree, I hope not, about the variety of standards that are necessary, and they're not just technical standards. So the things that we talk about often with our industry about the practices they should adopt to better protect themselves, it's largely about risk management. So that is basically developing the processes and the procedures so you can deal with those emerging issues when they come out. So it's not about a prescriptive set of technical standards, but it's really about developing that capacity so that understanding that there will be incidents, that there will be changes based on new technologies you're using, new vulnerabilities. And so it's not only about the underlying technical standards, but also making sure that that rigor is there for organizations to understand how to manage new risks.
Hi, I'm Paul Vixie, Farsight Security. I wanted to follow up on Chip Sharp's point about Smurf attacks. I once had a T-shirt given to me by Bill Woodcock that said, "No IP-directed broadcast." And that's what we were all typing into our routers then, because Cisco had not made it the default because they were afraid they were going to break everybody's config. So I had a long talk with Fred Baker, who is a Cisco distinguished fellow of some kind and was also on the board of ISC, so I had many chances to argue with him about BCP38 and the defaults. And I remember him explaining exactly how many configurations that would break. So I have a story and then an observation. My story concerns open recursion in bind, because for many years bind would by default answer any recursive query that came to it with no default ACL on what the source addresses were. In other words, if you had a name server and it could be reached through your firewall, then it was willing to provide service to the internet. And eventually we realized that that was a problem, and we fixed it. And first we created the ability for people to change their configs, and then we added some config warnings, and then a couple of years later we announced that we were going to change the default, and then a year after that we changed the default, and it broke everything because 5 years was not enough for the community to adapt, and we got a lot of complaints. But it was the right thing. Now the difference is ISC is a nonprofit company and does the right thing because it has no shareholders. Cisco has slightly different priorities, and I understand that. I don't want to seem ignorant of that. However, just as you ought to reboot your Linux server at least once every 3 years before the uptime can get to 4 digits, in case it would not reboot because of some config change, you ought to learn this. You ought to reboot things periodically just to see if they can. The same is true of our configurations. I think Cisco has a responsibility to break stuff periodically and to cause their supported customer base to expect that every couple of years they're going to have to make a change to that 15-year-old Perl script that's generating that config. And I think that anybody who is on the receiving end of a 400 gigabit per second DDoS that is caused by a whole bunch of Cisco's customers not turning this on has absolutely no sympathy for your shareholders. Thank you.
Don't know if you care to respond, but
Thank you.
okay.
If I may, I would like to respond. From a consumer point of view, you introduced two very important notions. It's the default setting, the privacy or the security default settings, or whatever configuration or requirements, or whatever interface we are discussing about, being a web page, being an app, or whatever. This is something that is extremely important, and the impact of the lack of adoption of certain standards, of course, has the effect of total lack of trust from consumers' point of view. This is not only because of the lack of standards, there are also other elements, but the recent security scandals, online scandals, have really they have quite an important negative impact. And the solution for us is the default setting. So to provide the higher default setting from a security, from a privacy point of view, so that for the applications that are for consumers, of course, so that consumers can eventually choose to downgrade and to have lower levels. And it is especially because of children and young people using technologies sooner and sooner for everything. It is important to protect them by default. This is what we ask in our standardization work, not only for the internet, but in general. And then more savvy users or professional users, of course, this is a totally different discussion, can better adapt the levels of security to their own needs. But I would like really to remind all of us that children are online at the age of 3, 4 already, and that they also represent a very important market for certain developers, and this is something that needs to be carefully taken into account when also discussing security. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara, and thank you for answering the question I wanted to ask right now already. I'm going to make it this very black and white and not personal. Please don't take it that way. But I see a group of people here who are very happy with themselves and the work they do and all the measures they take. If we make it very black and white. And I see people raising concerns. This is going perhaps not in the direction where we want it to go. So there is a divide or a schisma or whatever we want to call it in the panel, and that's of course a good thing, because then you can have a debate and not everybody agreeing with each other. Yes, we are so on the same track. If we're moving slowly towards the end of the panel, of course, by now, if we look at these concerns and the work that is being done, which is obviously being done good because the internet works. Let's not forget that. It works, everybody accesses it, and look at just in this room how many people are on the internet, and in this whole building, and go on from there. It works, but there are also grave concerns. As a question, a bit provocative, for example, Jari, I heard a story last year from somebody from the Ministry of Economic Affairs who went to the IGF for the first time, saw everybody run off into a room and was standing there on his own saying, okay, I want to learn what's happening here, and if you make it black and white again, 4 days later he saw everybody come out of the room, and I thought, why was I in Berlin for 4 days? Is there a way to change that? Because it was not Thomas, it was one of his colleagues. But he told me this story, and I make it a bit more juicy than it really was, of course. But how can you engage better so that the governments get to understand what you do, but perhaps also that the technical community can learn perhaps from concerns that governments have, that after that the technical community can pick up and come up with a solution. And let's start there, and from there perhaps look at what roles of governments and consumer organizations could be, because it could be for Chiara the same sort of story as that it was for this person. So let's start there, Jari.
Yeah, so I just wanted to touch on this black and white thing first. And I mean, I don't think anyone on the panel is saying that we have no problem. We certainly have a major problem many issues going on. It's just that we're trying to characterize the problems and understand why they occur. There's some fundamental reasons. We talked about that with Chip and others. So we do have a lot of work ahead of us. So that's clear. We're trying to understand how to do that work best. And I'm a firm believer that we just need to be more connected, understand more of the space, not just with the small group of engineers in the corner or the government meeting somewhere, but we together need to understand and interact more, and there's multiple places for that. We have some programs in the IGF to try to do that more and more. We're learning how to do that. It's not always easy, but we're trying. Drawing more participation from non-traditional or non-engineer circles. I think this meeting, the IGF, is a great place to do some of that. But it can't stop at that. We sort of have to find just these like-minded people in these meetings and go off and do something about some of these tasks, whether it's PCP 38, which is kind of an old topic, or something newer, spam. Maybe some of the more things could be done more widely. So I urge all of us to try to actually go and do something about this and write with your government colleague or a new document or recommendation for people to do more.
Well, I think thank you for this, because you're reaching out, and also I heard you last year, because that's why we basically have this panel. You are reaching out. So thank you. Atli.
Yeah. So yes, the internet works, but the problems are getting bigger and bigger and nastier as well at times. So I think this is also where the use of standards, but maybe not in the form of the technical ones, but we have a lot of work like what Adam is doing on the cybersecurity framework. And this is to make sure that people do not adopt a piecemeal solution at addressing security problems. So it's not just that I'm afraid of DDoS, but there's also other threats like insider threats or malware and this and that. And this is where work like cybersecurity framework of NIST, the ISO 27001 ISMS, and in many places, at least in Asia Pacific that I'm aware of, many of the government, from the regulator standpoint of view and or similar organization are encouraging people to look at security from the bigger picture and make sure that you have done everything that you can do to make sure that you are safe from these threats and minimize the risk of things from happening in your network. So this is where I think not only looking at it from the perspective of we should get everybody to do this or making it mandatory, but also supporting the work. And I think there's a relevant forum that discusses things like ISO 27001, and in some countries they extract some parts of that to make sure that at least these are the basic stuff that organization must do, so that when you have these things in place, you are aware of what resources you need to commit to ensure security, or you can assure security, or achieve resiliency when things happen, because we know that things may happen, whether you have done your best or not. And also, when you have similar organization in a particular sector adopting this kind of standards, then you can also start benchmarking and measuring and one another, and then you can compare notes, and from there you can make more improvement. So I think it's not that government are not doing it. I think there's a lot of work being done already, at this end, trying to get people to look at security, from the bigger picture. And there are many guides that people can actually, or standards that are in place that people can actually start using and looking into.
Thank you. Parna.
There's also one other aspect that we haven't really discussed, which is a way that we can all work together to sort of improve security, which is building awareness of what users can do themselves to ensure security online, right? So I've been doing this work for a while, but I think in the last year I've read or been sent a link to probably 10 articles on two-factor authentication. I've been using it for a long time, but I literally don't think before this year I had ever seen anything in a mainstream newspaper about it, right? So that's one example of something that has gained greater awareness in the user community, but there are lots of other sort of best practices for user empowerment that we could do a better job of sharing.
Thank you. Thomas.
Sorry, I just would like to totally disagree with what you just said, and it is contrary to what I just said myself. You need to provide the higher and highest level of protection by default because you can't count on users to protect themselves. So I think that this is really something that you need to rethink.
I completely disagree. So I think, the idea of mandate, so I think two-factor authentication is a great idea. I use it all the time. But the idea that you should mandate that when it relies on having access to, in most cases it relies on having access to a mobile phone, like that may or may not be something that somebody has, right? And so you could be creating a huge cost to get onto our services by mandating that as the default, right? It could make it impossible if all you have is a landline connection. Think of a grandma in wherever, not my grandma, but in some rural small town in wherever, all she might have is a landline connection to the internet. This is going to do her no good whatsoever and increase her costs. So I don't think that it's right to say that, that we should always have the highest standard as the default.
So we have some disagreement here, which is good. Probably the answer is somewhere in the middle. That the end user cannot do anything by himself because they probably don't understand the deeper implications, but perhaps need training. That's also something which is discussed, the driver's license of the internet, you can hear that one. But the other one is that he can't find everything by himself probably, and that's where the awareness starts in, and where do you find each other on reasonable ground. Thomas, you want to respond also?
I think the adoption by practices, or let's say the way people are connecting themselves and using their equipment, that's another thing. I think the thing which because we have also programs in the Netherlands sponsored by the government, which let's say subsidizes also lessons at school, giving a kind of let's say youngsters also a kind of diploma. For I did a very good course, and now I have my diploma safe internet in. So these things should be done by all means. I think the topic of this this setting is more the adoption of internet standards, and then specifically I think security standards, by companies, by networks. And there I think, at least we see in the Netherlands, that we don't see a role by enforcing standards or by, let's say, making new regulation for which 80% will not be effective. Especially not in an environment which is so quickly as the internet. When we make a ruling in a year's time, it's finished, and then some other environment is ruling the market. I think what I just said before, I think there is a question of market failure. Maybe that's a strong term, but there is something hindering because of this externalities effects that market parties are not adopting standards because it's costs are too high, they don't get the benefits, it's only long-term benefit. So there should be something done in which I think the government could be something.
And what are your thoughts, or at the ministry? What are the thoughts at the ministry at this stage?
First of all, I think a kind of enabling, facilitating function, that you get parties together which maybe out of themselves will not, let's say, take this effort. And secondly, you can, what we did with other projects, you can let's say, not subsidize some project, but give a kind of first subsidy for setting up a system or setting up a secretariat or something that then market parties themselves own. I mean, and they themselves working it out. I mean, as a government, we don't want to be involved only if it's purely necessary. So I think that basically that's something which, and there's also very much benefits of, at least we saw this in our own strategy or division you talked about in the Netherlands. There's a synergy in getting, let's say, all parties together about the whole set of security standards, which involves also, I mean, IPv6 is not security standard, but it's part of a kind of suite in which DNSSEC, DKIM and others are part of. And to treat this as a kind of suite which, together with all BGP, but that's not a standard, but that's more practice you should use as ISP, to try to have a kind of concerted action as, let's say, as a national stakeholders.
Thank you. We're going to turn to Michael Reardon. MOG is already involved in getting other sort of parties, law enforcement and governments into discussion. You've worked with government on the botnet project, for example. Would that work in this case, the US? We also work with MOG in other continents and countries. An example like this, could that be an example of a way forward? A first mover stimulus, let's call it that way?
It's not something that we've run into, and we haven't run into the necessity for it. I mean, the kind of thing that we do in a relatively cooperative manner really hasn't been necessary for us. That they've needed, the nudge has had to be given. But I think it also depends on the local environment. For example, a number of years ago, we had some of the MORG members come from Japan. And they came and they presented on the project that had been sort of nudged by the Japanese government to some extent to block port 25. And it was spectacularly successful in terms of blocking outbound spam from Japan. And the graphs they showed, it was like, someone had, the outbound spam had fallen off a cliff. It suddenly disappeared. So I think it depends on it certainly depends on the national environment that you're working within, and what might work, for example, in a more cooperative or with a different cultural understanding, won't always work in certain other countries. And that, I think, is quite a significant differentiator. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
And that is a good conclusion. That is completely true, of course. We're moving really toward the end of the session. We haven't touched upon all the questions, but that's usually the case. But I think everybody had the chance to speak his mind. Let's look ahead. What if we are a year from now? What would you like to have achieved on this topic? Are we still addressing the same challenges we're facing right now? Or what could actually change that we turn left instead of in the right direction, in the straight direction? Let's just start with you, Chip. What would your advice for the coming year be?
For anyone in particular or my own company?
Let's start with Cisco and perhaps move it from there, if you like to be more general also, because we touched upon a lot of topics now.
Yeah, I think, whatever it is, your wish list of things, if we could get, the best current practices, actually deployed, even within our own network, and then with our products, all of our products supporting it. If I could, have a wish, it would be that all of our applications and products support a secure IPv6, implementation. That would be a wish list as well. But as we roll out IPv6, we discover more new things that come up, and then we have to fix them. So it'll be an interesting deployment, and as the world deploys it even more. So I think that would be kind of a wish for the next year, as to, we can get that straightened out, get our development straightened out, so that we're we're moving down that road. Thank you. But we're working for it. And also, I'd like to say, in terms of the Netherlands, is a member of the Common Criteria, recognition agreement, right? So that's one thing that that has done is, we have the common criteria testing that is, Netherlands is one of the countries that does recognize that. So we're happy about that. Thank you.
Chiara.
Yes, thank you. What we would like to have in 1 or 2 years, to have sound and legitimate standards for authentication and e-signature, e-certificates for consumers to be able to use with confidence internet or apps or whatever. And also we would like to have better enforcement of legislation of standards at the international level. So this requires a lot of international collaboration. The lack of repression of online fraud for consumers is really something that is very frustrating, and it has an economic cost, which is consumers are bearing, and solutions have to be found about it.
Thank you. Jari.
Yeah, so I'll just continue saying that this further cooperation is needed. I just wanted to pick up one example. I think you said earlier that's difficult for the consumer opinions to show up in standards, or at least in all types of standards bodies. And I think that's actually, it should be possible, and it can be possible, and we look forward to your input. So why don't we try to establish some channels where that's actually possible. I think we all do care who build things that relate to end users, that they actually work well for the end users and not just for the companies who deploy it.
Adli.
Yeah. Maybe just 2 points. One is that I think this sort of discussion could be useful if you can take it also to the regional and the national IGF session, because probably we can get more input and feedback and sort of present the issue that is relevant to the various communities out there. One particular topic that is of interest out of the discussion is the question about the basic settings for end users. I think I really like that, because as it is, I think there is some expectation from us in many of our cybersecurity programs that people must do a lot of things to achieve security. So maybe we can look at it from a different angle, that why don't we just make it easy for them to do security without expecting them to do so much. So I think maybe this is probably another type of discussion that I would definitely like to get involved with moving forward.
So awareness raising could be an important topic going towards 2015.
Awareness raising, but also working on the on looking at from the standard side of things as well. What are the basic standards that we expect for normal users to use?
Thank you. Adam.
So I'm going to introduce one thing that we didn't talk about before, maybe for the next session as well, is we didn't really make a good distinction around performance standards and the more technical standards. So when we think about the authentication discussion, it's possible that both panelists will agree. It just might be a point of time or more long-term what the goal is. And so I think that's kind of the right approach that we think of. It's less about, it's really looking at the outcome that you're trying to achieve, and then that allows the companies to innovate and how you get there. So I think in the course of the next year or two, I guess I would echo in terms of increased participation in the standards bodies, increased awareness of what consumers should do, and I think increased adoption of risk management practices across all sorts of industry would be good to see.
Thomas?
Yes. Very short. I think what I would like to see is a kind of, in a couple of years, that operators of networks and services, information society services, but also governments, all actors would in one way or another made more accountable for what they're doing. And because we have seen, one of the hardest things we have in the Netherlands is that, for example, we're talking with our ISPs, and I think 5 years ago they said, okay, we'll go implement IPv6, and they keep telling this, and then the next time they say, no, you will implement it, but now it will be later. So there's no way of I mean, I don't want to enforce it, but I would like to see that not only ISPs, maybe that's only one example about standards and also how they manage their networks, the openness of their networks, but also bad hosting, for example, which introduces a lot of bad things into the Netherlands and also into the rest of the world. Just ways of by self-organization or other ways in which market parties, including governments, could be made much more accountable for what they do for the, let's say, the security of their users.
Michael?
To some extent, I'd echo Adam in as much as I'd like to see increased participation by people in standards bodies. I mean, just on a personal note, I can't think of a standards body that I haven't entered normally with trepidation, thinking, how can I possibly contribute? I mean, going to your first IETF meeting, speaking about your colleague, I'm not surprised he was a bit nervous. I mean, any place you go where they reach consensus by humming, and they do have, and obsess about cookies, is always it's an interesting place to begin, but it's a very functional organization. But it does take getting stuck in. If you don't get stuck in, you're not going to get be part of the process. I'm sorry, it's a very harsh thing to say.
Aparna?
Peril of going last is that the best ideas are usually out there. But I'll conclude by sort of echoing a number of folks who have said, I think, in the coming years, if we could really sort of build awareness and understanding of how the standard setting process works, especially for internet standards, through not only the technical community, but with governments, with non-governmental stakeholders who aren't traditionally involved, that would be real progress.
Okay, and I'll make my final question before turning to the room for final questions. The IGF has introduced this year for the first time best practice forums on 5 topics. Could this, you see the first reaching out happening, but everybody's still searching for its place in that reach out. Could it be an idea to have a best practice forum or whatever they're going to call it next year, because not everybody's happy with the term, on this topic, and that you can actually start talking to each other through WebEx calls, through a comment list, to have some sort of a paper drafted that could be a head start into getting to know each other better, what topics should be or you would like to have discussed together, and then maybe could easily reach out within your own communities and invite other people in that they can start acting on the right topics straight away. Would that process which IGF is going to facilitate in the coming year at least, and perhaps after that, be of use to this topic? See nodding yes or no, but
I know that it wouldn't be redundant, because when I look out at this room, there are a number of faces that I recognize from all sorts of standards bodies. We're already talking on a regular basis. You come up on a panel and you go, oh yeah, we met so-and-so. I mean, there's Mike Kaiser down there, there's Paul Vixie over there, there's Barry Lieber over there. There's all a big bunch of people that you know anyhow, that you've been working with. This is already going. And I mean, maybe what's happened is that some of it's now moved to the IGF and made it a little more real. And I don't know whether that's the case. This is my first IGF, so I don't know what the norms are, and I didn't quite know what to expect, but I was actually pleasantly surprised by the fact that a lot of real people turned up.
Okay. Is that the same for you, Thomas, or for you, Adam, or? Thank you, Barna. Thank you.
Well, I echo what you were saying, Michael. The point is that we are looking very quickly around. I think there are still a lot of usual suspects now, in meaning that what we are saying now is a little bit restricted to our own ears. So, and I mean the impact of non-adoption of standards, security standards, is one basic element of, let's say, prospering the internet, making it more safe and secure. So I would say having such a workshop, or I don't know if making a paper is okay, that's I can't judge it now, but to try to get more attention for standards and the way you can foster and progress them is something which is definitely something which I would like to see, but then in a broader audience than this. Thank you.
Was that for you, Chiara? Or Adam after?
Well, I think the question would be what would be the appropriate scope, and then how would that be relevant to the IGF? So perhaps the scope wouldn't be trying to reinvent some of the really good work that happens in other forums, but perhaps it's at this question that we were talking about earlier about how do we inform policymakers about what's going on in those standards bodies in more technical forms.
If you thought I would want to reinvent the wheel, then it's a good comment. I'm not. I'm trying to find something that may be overarching, which brings the right people to the table, brings the issues or challenges they face, and from there go back to your own communities. And could the IGF help with the identification of those challenges and those people that you perhaps are missing at the table right now? Chiara?
All fora of discussion are to be welcome, of course, but discussions are not enough. Actions are needed, and therefore, if there are no roadmaps with deliverables and way to check how they are implemented and really enforcement as far as cybersecurity is concerned, I'm afraid that there are other fora of discussion where discussion are already taking place. So they would need, I'm not familiar enough about the mechanism behind those best practices forum, you can tell me, but there should be an added value. And the added value that I see is really in being concrete, in having an impact on cybersecurity in this case. Otherwise, I wouldn't see an added value.
Thank you. We want to turn to the room. Are there any last questions? I will take two. Roelof. Mag je nu zelf voorstellen?
Yeah, Wout, maybe I can respond to your question too. And my answer would be no, it won't help. I don't think talking is going to solve the problem. I don't think talking is the problem either. If I take an example of the NSEC implementation in the Netherlands, we, as the National Registry, have spent a lot of money and other efforts on getting the NSEC implemented, from sponsoring the development of signing software, sponsoring development of registrar software, doing trainings for registrars, implementing an financial incentive for registrars to sign their portfolio. So that all ended up in almost 2 million of the 5.5 million .nl domains being signed. But now if we look at, for instance, the uptake by banks, and one could, I think, easily argue that that would be the important domains to sign, they, in most cases, are their own registrar. And they decided not to sign. And we've been talking to them over the last 2-3 years, trying to convince them to do so, and they haven't moved. PayPal has signed, but most of our banks haven't. So what we did is last week we sent them a draft article that we were going to publish, which made this clear, that the banks are not signing. And now suddenly they became active. I got all kinds of letters, phone calls, reactions to the draft article, and they want to talk to me and to other parties on how they're going to sign their domains. So I think in the end the solution is probably to put a bit more pressure on those organizations, those companies that should implement internet standards. Because I think Jari made that remark also, that quite often I think they look a bit too little into the future and too much very close to themselves. So they see the cost short term. They don't see the benefits and the risks long term. I don't know why. Maybe it's the pressure of the shareholders to come up with quick results or something like that. But I don't think that talking and explaining is always the solution. I think there has to be pressure. And it can be from other parties, it can be naming and shaming, it can be, and that's probably the worst kind of pressure, a huge security incident with a lot of customers suffering from that. And sometimes I think it can also be the government.
Okay, I think that's a very clear example. Thank you, Roelof. This is your opportunity to speak. Last question. Everybody happy? Okay, then I'm going to thank our panel today for your insights and your debate on the topic, which I think was quite excellent. So Please, a round of applause.